All right. Our next speaker is Inken, also from CISPA. She's going to talk about MBeacon.
Okay, I will present you the MBeacon system, which is essentially a search engine for methylation data. But what is methylation data all about? Besides the DNA, there are other molecules in the cell that tell it what to do. One of the most important of these molecules are methylation groups being attached to the DNA at specific positions. In a nutshell, methylation changes how the DNA can be copied and thereby expressed in the cell. Different cell types have different methylation patterns. This is also part of the answer why your muscle cells look so different from your skin cells, for example. But also environmental factors such as smoking or stress influence methylation. Most importantly, diseases such as cancer change the methylation patterns and are therefore studied by biomedical researchers. But also for us as privacy researchers, methylation data is of interest because it may leak whether a person smokes, is stressed, the age of the person, or whether a person has cancer. Methylation data is expressed as a fraction of methylated molecules found at specific DNA positions. Intermediate values can occur due to different cell types being mixed up in the cell, or different methylation in the two strings of the DNA. But that is all I can tell you about the biology, because I'm a computer scientist and not a biomedical researcher. For me, methylation is just a long vector of real-valued entries between 0 and 1. The length is typically 450,000. This is what the currently fastest and cheapest measurement techniques produce. Nevertheless, sequencing methylation data is still a complex and costly process. Therefore, biomedical researchers might prefer to access data that is already sequenced. But that might be a long and complicated process to get access, just to find out that the methylation data does not contain the data they need for their studies. So what if we could turn this black box research institute into a gray box, thought the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health? And they invented the Beacon system for genome data. Everyone can query it and find out whether specific DNA features are part of the data. And thereby they know in advance whether getting access to the data is worth the effort. Despite the sparse yes-no answer format, malicious entities can query the Beacon and find out whether their target is part of the database. And because databases are usually set up for specific diseases, attackers can find out that their target is part of the database and thereby has this disease. This is where we as privacy researchers come into play. We mitigate the privacy threat. Additionally, we change the interface from DNA data to methylation data. Hence, we add an M and call it MBeacon. So let's start by understanding the attack and then the defenses. The attacker knows the target's methylation data, or at least part of it. And the attacker's goal is to distinguish two situations, one in which the target is part of the database and one in which the target is not. So the attacker starts by picking a methylation value and a methylation position and asking the MBeacon, is there someone with a methylation value of, say, 0.33 at position I? The first problem we had to solve was to change the methylation data interface from discrete DNA data, those 4 DNA bases, to continuous methylation values. We proposed to bin the values into equidistant bins. 10 bins usually work fine, but I will show you the evaluation later. So in this case, we would search for methylation data between 0.3 and 0.4 and return a yes answer if we find at least one matching entry. Then the attacker goes on, picks the next methylation value, asks the next query, and the next one. It might happen that the attacker gets a no answer even though the target is part of the database. Or the other way around, the attacker might get a yes answer even though the target is not part of the database, but there's someone else with a similar value. Over multiple queries, we, however, expect to get more yes answers if the target is part of the database. This can be used in a likelihood ratio test. Let me show you the 2 most important ingredients for it. First, let's look at the yes answers. The attacker might get a yes answer because the target is in fact part of the database, or because there is someone else with a similar value. Well, if we could just know the probability of an arbitrary person having this methylation value, we could estimate the likelihoods. We can know that by assuming the data is normally distributed and with known mean and standard deviation. In fact, these distributions are known in the genome case, and for methylation data, means and standard deviations for specific positions are often published in research papers. And even though the true MBeacon distribution might be slightly different from this normal distribution, this rough estimate suffices. Second, let's look at the nuances that might occur even though the target is not part of the data, is part of the database. This might happen because the data the attacker owns and the data in the database are slightly different, like in this example. For example, because the two copies differ due to different environmental factors, due to changing methylation over time, or just measurement errors. We denote this probability by delta and evaluate empirically. Which brings me to the evaluation now. So we collected several methylation data sets of diseased patients, and we set up methylation beacons of a total size of 60. This might sound very small to you, however, this is how currently data sets look like. On the x-axis, we experiment with a different number of bins, and we experiment with different numbers of queries submitted and different levels of delta, which you see in the different plots. On the y-axis, we plot the AUC, which is the attack performance. 0.5 here means the attack is as bad as random guessing, while 1.0 means it's perfect. And we are pretty close to that. Only 10 queries suffice for 10 bins for 0.9 AUC. Let me stress here that the attacker, of course, optimizes and asks those queries that she thinks she will learn from the most. So for the defense, let's go back one step and think about what the attacker actually exploits. The attacker can learn something about the true MBeacon distribution only if the expected answer and the answer the attacker actually gets is different. For example, if the attacker expects to get a yes answer, but the MBeacon says no, or the other way around, if the attacker expects there shouldn't be anyone in this database, and the MBeacon says yes. If we add a little bit of noise, we might get rid of the problem. To make it differentially private, we have to add the noise everywhere. But the hard band on these highly privacy-relevant cases where the distribution noticeably differ helps to scale down the overall noise level. So how does this work? Upon a query, we still look it up in the database how many people have this value. Let's call this D. But then we draw noise from the Laplace distribution. It is scaled to the privacy parameter C, which is the overall budget of how many highly privacy-relevant queries we can answer. Additionally, it is scaled to the privacy parameters epsilon1 and epsilon2 that we evaluate empirically. And it is scaled to the sensitivity delta, which is 1 in this case. This captures how much the database output fluctuates if we change one entry in the database. With this noise, we make a noisy comparison to T, this threshold of how many people do we need in the database to actually output a yes. Typically, that's 1, but we leave it as a parameter here. Well, if we expect a yes and get a yes answer, not much privacy is lost. Similarly, if we expect a no answer and get a no. However, if the comparison shows we are on two different sides of the threshold, privacy is at risk, and we have to reduce the current privacy budget. No matter in which situation we actually were, we can output the noisy result and answer some more queries until at some point the privacy budget runs out. Then the beacon has to stop answering forever, which is of course something MBeacon owners would like to avoid, so we have to evaluate it empirically. But before we come to that, let me explain you the name SVT square. We took inspiration from the sparse vector technique SVT, which does one comparison to a noisy threshold, and everything that's above is considered highly privacy relevant and reduces the current privacy budget. In our case, we are not so much concerned with how many people are in the database, just whether it's more or less than T. Therefore, we do this double comparison and call it SVT square. And we also had to redo the differential privacy proof. So, is this whole thing useful at all? To evaluate that, we first need to define what useful actually means. Recall that we want to allow a researcher to find further data of interest. Let's call this population P. In the worst case for the researcher, this is the minority in the beacon, and there is another population, let's call it D, that is the majority. Utility is then for the researcher the ability to distinguish an MBeacon with few data of interest from an MBeacon without any data of interest at all. In the realistic case, the attacker has a target from either population and attacks both types of beacons. However, the typical attacker in our case would not have these two different populations. Therefore, to be more comparable, we add a second attacker type, which just has targets from the majority population D and just attacks this one MBeacon. So this brings me to the second part of the evaluation. Again, we take our MBeacon of a total size of 60, but this time we mix in patients from another disease population to mimic these patients of interest. You see on the axis how many of them we mix in. Without any further privacy protection, the researcher has a high utility, but the attacker is also pretty good, which means we have a high privacy problem here. So let's switch on SVT square for carefully chosen parameters. Especially the privacy budget might sound very large for you, but this is only 20% of all the queries that can be asked. And it did not run out for all of our experiments. We see that the researcher's utility drops, but still it remains a useful system for the researcher. The standard attack is successfully mitigated. The attacker is not better than randomly guessing. And for the more realistic case, the attack is at least greatly reduced. But this comes at a price. The researcher has to ask more queries to get high certainty in the answer. So let me conclude. We redesigned MBeacon, a query interface for methylation data, to help researchers to find more data of interest. And to mitigate the imminent privacy threat, we designed SVT square, which achieves differential privacy by comparing the expected and true MBeacon output in a noisy way. Thank you.
We have time for questions. Please come to the mic. Questions? Let's start with one. So could you comment on why the population is typically so small? Like why isn't it tens of thousands of people?
Because it's
my question was about population. Why is it typically so small? Why is it 60 as opposed to tens of thousands of patients?
so the typical size of methylation data that's currently available. I think sequencing methylation is at the point so costly that it's hard to get large-scale databases. But of course, we expect these databases to grow in the future.
Questions? We have time for questions. Ask one more. So you mentioned that when the privacy budget runs out, the system doesn't answer any more queries. Is that the design that you have, or do you sort of envision somehow restarting the system, or somehow like answering to a different population of query like clients?
So for this data set, if the query budget runs out, it has to stop answering, and there's no way to recover due to the theory that's behind our SVT square algorithm. And this is why in our evaluation, we make sure that we set the privacy budget in a way that it does not run out. Because we assume that there are many queries that can be answered that are not highly privacy relevant. And if we find empirically the right number of queries, then we can set the privacy budget right, and then we don't risk running out of budget.
Would this create a possibility for a denial of service attack, for attackers to send a whole bunch of queries to disable the database?
If the budget is set right, no denial of service should be possible.